Text 37 Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Kamayesha Krodayesha Rajo Gunasamudbhava Mahashano Mahapapma Vidhi Eram Hivairinam. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, the personality of God, it said Kama, lust, Esha, this Krodha, wrath, Esha, this Rajo Guna, the mode of passion, Samudbhava, born of Mahashana, all devouring, Mahapapma, greatly sinful, Vidhi, no, Enam, this, Iha, in the material world. Vairinam, greatest enemy. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later transformed to wrath, which is the all devouring sinful enemy of this world. Purport. When a living entity comes in contact with the material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust in the association with the mode of passion, or in other words, the sense of love of God becomes transformed into lust as milk comes in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt. Then again, when lust is unsatisfied, it turns into wrath. Wrath is transformed into illusion. Illusion continues the material existence. Therefore, lust is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and it is lust only which induces the pure living entity to remain entangled in the material world. Wrath is the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. These modes exhibit themselves as wrath and other corollaries. If therefore the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the mode of ignorance, is elevated to the mode of goodness by the prescribed method of living and acting, then one can be saved from the degradation of wrath by the spiritual attachment. The Supreme Personality of Godhead expanded himself into many for his ever increasing spiritual bliss, and the living entities are parts and parcels of the spiritual bliss. They also have partial independence, but by the misuse of their independence, when the service attitude is transformed into the propensity for sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. When the service attitude is transformed into the propensity for sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. This material creation is created by the Lord to give facility to the conditioned souls to fulfill these lustful propensities. And when completely baffled by the prolonged lustful activities, the living entity begins to inquire about their real position. This inquiry is the beginning of the Vedanta Sutras, wherein it is said, Atato Brahma Jigyasa, one should inquire into the Supreme, and the Supreme is defined in the Srimad Bhagavatam as Janmadasya Yato Anvayad Itarastascha, or the origin of everything is the Supreme Brahman. Therefore, the origin of lust is also in the Supreme. If therefore lust is transformed into the love for the Supreme, or transformed into Krishna consciousness, or in other words, by desiring everything for Krishna, then both lust and wrath can be spiritualized. Hanuman, the great servitor of Lord Ram, exhibited his wrath by burning the golden city of Ravan, but by doing so, he became the greatest devotee of the Lord. Here also in the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord induces Arjuna to engage his wrath upon his enemies for the satisfaction of the Lord. Therefore, lust and wrath, when they are employed in Krishna consciousness, become our friends instead of our enemies. Text 38. Dhumena vrete vaniryata darsho malena cha Vitolbena avrito garbhas tata tenedam avritam. Dhumena, by smoke, avriyate is covered. Vahani, fire, yata, just as adarshaha, mirror, malena, by dust, cha, also. Yata, just as ulbena, by the womb, avrita is covered. Garbha, embryo, tata, so, they. Tena, by that lust, idam, this, avritam is covered. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. Purport: there are 3 degrees of covering of the living entity, by which his pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under different manifestations, like smoke in the fire, dust on the mirror, and the womb about the embryo. When lust is compared to smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be a little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits Krishna consciousness slightly, it may be likened to the fire covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary when there is smoke, there is no overt manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of Krishna consciousness. The dust on the mirror refers to a cleansing process of the mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy names of the Lord. The embryo covered by the womb is an analogy illustrating a helpless position, for the child in the womb is so helpless that he cannot even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life by such great exhibition of lust that they are almost void of all consciousness. The covered mirror is compared to the birds and the beasts, and the smoke-covered fire is compared to human being in the form of a human In the form of a human being, the living entity may revive a little Krishna consciousness, and if he makes further development, the fire of spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke in the fire, fire can be made to blaze. Therefore, the human form of life is a chance for living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy lust by the cultivation of Krishna consciousness under the able guidance. Text 39. Avatam jnanametena jnanino nityavairina kamarupena kaunteya duspurena nelenecha. Avritam covered, jnanam pure consciousness, etena by this, jnanina of the knower, nityavairina by the eternal enemy, kamarupena in the form of lust, kaunteya O son of Kunti, duspurena never to be satisfied, anelina by the fire, cha also. Thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Purport. It is said in the Manusmriti that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment, just as fire is never extinguished by constant supply of fuel. In the material world, the center of all activities is sex, and thus this material world is called Maiduna Agara, or the shackles of sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within bars. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the laws of Lord are shackled by sex life. Advancement of material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of the material existence of a living entity. Therefore, this lust is a symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of sense enjoyment. Very important. So-called happiness is actually the enemy. Text 40. Indriyane mano buddhir asyadhishtana uchyate etair vimoyati esha jnanam avritta dehinam. Indriyane, the senses, mana, the mind, buddhi, the intelligence, asya of this lust, adhishtanam, sitting place, uchyate is called, etai, all this vimoyati, bewilders, esha, this lust, jnanam, knowledge, avritya, covering, dehinam, of the embodied. The senses and the mind and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. The enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all activities of the senses, and thus when we hear about the sense objects, the mind generally becomes a reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification, and as a result the mind and senses become repositories of lust. Next, the intelligence department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligence is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with matter. And thus with the mind and senses, and the spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam 10:84-13. यस्यात्म बुद्धि कुणपेति दादुके स्वधीश कलत्रादिषु भौम इज्यति यतीर्थ बुद्धि शलिलेन करिचित् जनेषु विघ्नेषु स एव गोखरा. A human being who identifies this body made of three elements with his self, who considers byproducts of the body to be his kinsmen, who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the holy place of pilgrimage simply to take a bath rather than meet men of transcendental knowledge, there is to be considered like an ass or a cow. Text 41. Tasmat tvam indriyanado niyamya bharatarshava papmanam prajahiyenam jnana vijnana nashanam. Tasmat, therefore, tvam, you, indriyani, senses, ado, in the beginning, niyamya, by regulating bharatarshava, O chief amongst the descendants of Bharata, papmanam, the great symbol of sin, praja, he curbed, he certainly, enam, this jnana of knowledge, vijnana and scientific knowledge of the pure soul, nashanam, the destroyer. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of Bharatas, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Purport. The Lord advised Arjuna to regulate the senses from the very beginning so that he could curb the great sinful enemy of lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization and specific knowledge of the self. Jnana refers to knowledge of self as distinguished from non-self, or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnana refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position as a relationship to the Supreme Soul. It is explained thus in the Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.31. Jnanam paramam guhyam me yad vijnana samanvitam saharasyam tadangam cha grahana gaditam maya. The knowledge of the self and the Supreme Self is very confidential and mysterious, but such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord Himself. Bhagavad Gita gives us that the general and specific knowledge of the self. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. So, from the very beginning of life, one has to learn this Krishna consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly. Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So, from any stage of life or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. Text 42. Indriyani paranya ahor indriyebhya param manasastu para buddhi yo buddhe parasastu sa. To saha indriyani senses parani superior, ahu are said indriyebhya more than the senses, param superior, mana the mind, manasa more than the mind, tu also para superior, buddhi intelligence, yaha who buddhi more than the intelligence, parata superior, tu saha he. The working senses are superior to dull matter, mind is higher than the senses, intelligence is still higher than the mind, and he the soul is even higher than the intelligence. The senses are different outlets for the activities of lust. Lust is reserved within the body, but it is given vent through the senses. Therefore, the senses are superior to the body as a whole. These outlets are not in use when there is a superior consciousness, Krishna consciousness. In Krishna consciousness, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the hierarchy of bodily functions as described here ultimately ends in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means the functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily actions. But since the mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and at rest, the mind will act as it does during dreaming. But above the mind is the determination of the intelligence, and above the intelligence is the soul proper. If therefore the soul is directly engaged with the Supreme, naturally all other subordinates, namely intelligence, mind and senses, will be automatically engaged. In the Kata Upanishad, there is a similar passage in which it is said that the objects of sense gratification are superior to senses and mind is superior to self-objects. If therefore the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chance at all that the senses will become engaged in other ways. This mental attitude has already been explained. Param Drishtva Nivartate. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord, there is no chance of its being engaged in the lower propensities. In the Kata Upanishad, the soul has been described as Mahan, the great. Therefore, the soul is above all, namely the sense objects, the senses, the mind and the intelligence. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution of the whole problem. With intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. That solves the whole problem. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of the senses, but aside from that, one has to strengthen the mind by use of intelligence. If by intelligence one engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness by complete surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically the mind becomes stronger, and even though the senses are very strong like serpents, they will be no more effective than serpents with broken fangs. But even though the soul is the master of intelligence in the mind and the senses are also, still unless it is strengthened by the association with Krishna, in Krishna consciousness there is every chance of falling down due to the agitated mind. Text 43. Evam buddhe param buddhva samstabhyatmanam atmana jahi shatru mahabaho kama rupam durafradam. Evam thus, buddhe to intelligence, param superior, buddhva knowing, samstabhya by studying, atmanam the mind, atmana by deliberate intelligence, jahi shatru the enemy, mahabaho almighty armed one, Kamarupam in the form of lust, Durasadam formidable. Translation: thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should study the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength one conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Purport: this third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness, the ultimate end. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities for lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for overlording and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and the intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribe duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind. By steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man toward spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purports to the third chapter of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita in the matter of Karma Yoga, or the discharge of one's prescribed duty in Krishna consciousness.